Lindsey Hilsum, today we're going to talk about the countries that either support Russia or remain neutral in this war. What are you going to tell me?
I'm going to tell you that the Western way of looking at the Russian invasion of Ukraine is not the only way of looking at it. And that where we here in Britain might see it as a moral issue, that's not how it looks everywhere else. And certainly in Africa, people see the colonial powers, who they resent, fighting Russia, which is the successor to the Soviet Union, which supported a lot of the liberation movements. And elsewhere in the world, people have all sorts of different interests. Countries have different interests which may make them support Russia, or at least may make them not want to align themselves with the West. So that is what is going on in geopolitics. And in the middle of it all, you have the Ukrainians who are fighting and dying.
Lindsey, I wanted to start by asking you about your recent trip back to Ukraine. It was your fourth visit this year, your third since the war began. I mean, what did you take back from your visit this time?
Well, most of the time we were in the east, northeast around Kharkiv, Donetsk, and then the Kherson area. It was the level of destruction, Kieran. It is just terrible that we would drive for miles and miles and every village would be destroyed. I mean, it is just rubble and houses like skeletons with just the timbers standing and all the bricks and the roof blown out.
And in terms of the destruction, we're now seeing, ever since the explosion on the Kerch Bridge in Crimea, that Russia has begun to retaliate. They've started bombing Ukrainian cities. They've started bombing the capital, Kyiv. I'm reminded of something you actually drew my attention to, which is what Barack Obama said back in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea, which was that Russia was no more than a regional power whose actions in Ukraine are an expression of weakness rather than strength. Is that still the case? And what are we talking about here, about Russia, the regional power or the superpower?
Well, I think that Russia is trying to be both. Obviously, the invasion of Ukraine, you could argue that that is regional. It's Russia trying to recapture part of its old empire. It's a colonial war. But it has global ramifications, and President Putin is only too aware of that. And his diplomats are out internationally trying to make sure that they start to get support. And it was interesting a couple of weeks ago that Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, was out around Africa trying to get support. And then Foreign Minister Kuleba from Ukraine did exactly the same. So globally, this is really important. And it's also about Russia saying, you cannot discount us. You may think that there's only one superpower, the Americans, and one aspiring superpower, the Chinese. But don't forget us. We are the successor to the Soviet Union, and we are really powerful too.
And one of the big events in recent weeks has obviously been the annexation of 4 regions of Ukraine: Luhansk, Kherson, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, by Russia. And although they don't fully control any of them, this has also not been recognized by the international community. And indeed, last week, the United Nations General Assembly had a vote on condemning that move of annexation. Now, the majority of countries, 143, voted to condemn, but 35 countries abstained, 4 voted against. And we're basically today going to talk about why that is, why those 39 countries either voted against or abstained. Now, of the 4 countries that voted against, Syria, Nicaragua, North Korea, and Belarus. Now, Belarus, we know, has President Lukashenko, who's one of Putin's close allies. North Korea has the dictator Kim Jong-un. Then we have Syria. The Russian forces, of course, came to the aid of President al-Assad during the civil war.
Of course, there's been a long-standing agreement between the Soviet Union and then Russia with Syria. But geopolitics abhors a vacuum. And when Barack Obama decided not to intervene in Syria back in 2012, 2013, the Russians moved in so that they could have a stake there in the Middle East. So that would be a place of Russian support in the Middle East. So that's exactly what I'm talking about Russia claiming its place on the world stage. So Syria, which, yes, now votes with Russia in the Security Council, that was by force of arms, Russian arms to President Assad's salvation.
And now the general who was involved in a lot of those Russian airstrikes in Syria is now in charge in Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, that's not very encouraging, isn't it? Given the appalling human rights abuse that went on in Syria and the bombing of Aleppo and other places. I mean, this is a man who knows no restraint and has absolutely no compunction in committing war crimes.
And then why Nicaragua then?
Well, I think that goes back to the Soviet Union because Daniel Ortega, who's the president in Nicaragua, he was the leader of the Sandinistas back in, when I was young and worked in Central America. What are we talking about? The late 70s, 79 was when you had the Sandinista revolution. And that was against Somoza, who was a dictator and who was Somoza backed by the United States. And Ortega came in backed by the Soviet Union and Cuba. So that, I think, is a throwback. And I think that as we go on to talk about the countries which still, are supporting Russia in this, or at least not opposing Russia in that, many of them have a nostalgia for the old days of the Soviet Union when their liberation movements, as they see it, were supported by the communists.
The Cold War casts a long shadow.
The Cold War casts a very long shadow, and that shadow has deepened through this invasion of Ukraine.
So let's look then at the two big powers that abstained from that vote on the annexation of those regions in Ukraine, China and India. Now, President Xi Jinping, arguably Russia's most important ally, and Putin, of course, met him a couple of weeks before the start of the war at the Beijing Winter Olympics, and they announced a no-limits partnership. I mean, firstly, Lindsey, why are China and Russia such close allies?
Well, I think this goes back to, it's a triumvirate, isn't it? So the big powers are the United States, China, and Russia, or previously the Soviet Union. So when you look at, go back to 1972, Henry Kissinger, why did Nixon and Kissinger go to China back then? It was because there was a split between the two communist states, between China and the Soviet Union. And so the Americans thought, well, we can jump in and completely split off the Soviet Union from China, and then we will be much stronger. And that has worked for many decades, certainly in terms of the prosperity of the world and the prosperity of China, and the marginalization of the Soviet Union, which then collapsed, some years later collapsed. But now you've got a shift, and so you have a rising China, which increasingly sees America as a rival, if not an enemy, and the compliment is returned. I mean, America sees China increasingly as a rival, not a partner. And so the Chinese want Russia on their side, 2 against 1. It's a geopolitical ganging up, you could say.
And under Xi Jinping, China has started moving away from not just the domestics, but also looking at a sort of a new international order, getting more aggressive when it comes to Taiwan. It also talks about NATO enlargement. So is it very much China sees Russia as an ally in that new international world order?
Yes, I think so. But there's also concern on China's part, because China is very clear that you shouldn't change borders. And that is because it does not want any of this separatist nonsense as it sees it from Tibet or Xinjiang or any other place within China. And it has always been clear that borders should not be changed and countries should not invade each other to change borders. And so it's actually against what Russia has done in principle. And that is actually quite awkward, I think, for the Politburo and for the Chinese Communist Party. It's quite awkward to make that work. And also because what the Chinese want is calm. They hate turbulence, they hate disorder, and they actually don't like the level of chaos internationally and in this area that has been created by this. And they have always recognized Ukraine as an independent country since it's gained its independence in 1991. So I think that the Chinese, while backing Russia, also do have they have some doubts and they have some concerns.
Because when Putin met with Xi in September, Putin said, "We highly value the balanced position of our Chinese friends when it comes to the Ukraine crisis. We understand your questions and concerns about this." And at the UN, China was one of the countries calling on negotiations over Ukraine and having peace. Are those concerns you're talking about, are they getting stronger?
I think they may be getting stronger as they see the war continuing and becoming more destructive and disruptive. I was talking to a Western diplomat at the UN the other day who said, they could feel a bit of, what should I put it, fungibility in the Chinese position, that they did not feel that China was wedded to Russia in the same way as it had been, because it is very concerned about the impact and the instability that the invasion of Ukraine may create. And, this is an instability in the former Soviet sphere. So we're looking at the stans, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan. Now, some of these countries border on China, so it affects China as well. So they do look on this with a great deal of worry, and they just wish it would either just stop or go away.
Let's move on then to India, another country that abstained in that vote. Now, ever since it became independent in 1947, and under the premiership of Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister, throughout the Cold War, it's always had a policy of non-alignment in international politics, never tying itself to one side when it came to the Cold War. Is that what essentially is continuing today under Narendra Modi?
To some extent, but these things with geopolitics, it's always, when you look at an individual country, you have to understand that what we think is the most important thing is not necessarily the most important thing to them. So what's the most important thing to India? The most important thing to India is Pakistan. Mm-hmm. That's what matters more than anything else, their enmity with Pakistan. So their relationship with America over many decades is always about, are the Americans selling weapons to Pakistan? How close to Pakistan is America, and so on. And recently America has been selling F-16 fighter jets to Pakistan. And so the Indians like to punish the Americans when they do anything like that, and so that's one of the reasons that they have, that they have been getting closer to Russia. Now, they are also getting cheap oil, which they like very much. But then you have another complication, which is that India has border disputes with China, and their relationship with China is very fractious.
The Indian government has been wavering as well, hasn't it? Because, Narendra Modi told Putin recently, this is not the era for war.
He did. He said it's not the time for war, it's the time for peace. And so I think that Narendra Modi, like Xi Jinping, is getting concerned about how long this war is going on, how destructive it is. And also, India as a state does not support the changing of borders. And so this war of aggression does cause concern in Delhi. They're not 100% behind President Putin, and they also would like this to come to an end.
Let's now look at the African continent when it comes to that UN vote on Russia's annexation of 4 regions in Ukraine. 26 African countries voted to condemn Russia, 19 others abstained. And the continent has been a focus of attention from Ukraine and Russia. The Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov visited the continent back in July, and 3 of the 4 states that he went to, Congo, Brazzaville, Ethiopia and Uganda, they all chose to abstain in that vote. And then we saw Ukraine's foreign minister visit the continent, and 4 nations that he went to, Ghana, Ivory Coast, Kenya and Senegal, they all voted to condemn Russia. And before we get into talking about Africa as a continent, remember, often we lump it together as one mass, when Africa is not a country. All of these nations have differing opinions when it comes to this war, and all of these nations have differing histories. But there has been, definitely, anger from some Western countries about those nations on the continent that have remained neutral since the start of the war.
Now, before we get into what's going on there, firstly, it's always important to not talk about Africa as one country.
Definitely.
But when it comes to why some may be neutral and ambivalent about the war in Ukraine, does it have a lot to do with that idea of the history of colonialism, the history of Africa as a continent being a pawn in the geopolitical conflict?
Yeah, look, when you look at South Africa, Mozambique, Angola, these are countries where anti-colonial liberation movements eventually came to power, which had a lot of backing from the Soviet Union. And I think that in those countries, Russia is the successor state to the Soviet Union. It's definitely not a communist state. I would argue it's not an anti-colonial state. I would argue it's a colonial state because President Putin is trying to recreate the Russian Empire. But to the leaders and many politicians in those countries in Southern Africa, the Soviet Union, then Russia, was an ally at the time that they were fighting Western colonialism. And that dies hard. It hasn't gone away. One of the things which was really interesting at the beginning of this conflict, which was that the Kenyan ambassador to the UN, Martin Kimani, got up in New York and he made a passionate speech against Russia, basically saying, in Africa, we have to accept the colonial borders, whether we like them or not, because if we don't, that way chaos lies. And therefore, we should be against any invasion of another country's sovereign territory.
We rejected irredentism and expansionism on any basis, including racial, ethnic, religious, or cultural factors. We reject it again today. Kenya registers its strong concern and opposition to the recognition of Donetsk and Luhansk as independent states. We further strongly condemn the trend in the last few decades of powerful states, including members of this Security Council, breaching international law with little regard.
You know, that was very eloquent, and it went down very well with the Europeans and with the Americans. It did not go down well with a lot of African leaders, that speech.
Because what is the difference why, countries like Kenya and Ghana, which have been against this war from the beginning, why are they on that side as opposed to others?
Well, I suppose Kenya didn't have a Soviet-backed liberation movement in the same way. It was like a different dynamic, and Ghana has moved very much to. I mean, Ghana really wants to be the sort of Malaysia of Africa. That's its position at the moment. So, as you say, I mean, African countries all have their different reasons, but a lot of stuff does go down to what happens in the UN. So, for example, Ethiopia, Abiy. Now, he's definitely anti-communist. He's part of a new wave of African leaders that came in after communism fell in Ethiopia. It was a communist government for many years, and he came on the sort of second wave after that. But he is waging a ruthless and truly terrible war in Tigray, in the north of his country, and Russia has abstained on UN votes, and Russia doesn't call him out on his human rights abuse and so on, whereas Western countries do.
And of course, I think another argument that many African countries will say is that this war is far away from us. This is a European conflict. This has nothing to do with us. But obviously, we are seeing that the effect on the food supply and the grain deliveries to places like the Horn of Africa has exacerbated famine in those areas. Does that not influence any countries in terms of how they might start viewing this war?
Yes, it does, but it depends on what narrative you buy. So what the Russians will say is it's because of sanctions that we have these problems, and the reason that you're not getting the grain you need is because of these horrible Western sanctions. And then there are other, and obviously the Ukrainians would say, well, it's the Russians which are blockading the port, the Black Sea ports. And I mean, they have now got some deal to get the grain out to some extent, but there's a lot of bottlenecks in that. And then, there are Russian talking points, which are like Russia and Ukraine are one people. And Ukraine was going to join NATO. And, this is Russia against the West. That's why you should be with us. So a lot of these talking points, which are definitely put out by Russian media and by Russian diplomats, make sense to some people in power in Africa. And I think that this is really important to understand, that this issue of colonialism, in this country, in Britain, we have a habit of saying, oh, it was all a long time ago and let's forgive and forget. That is not how it feels in Africa. And then you look at West Africa, you look at Mali, there's a huge resentment of France, the former colonial power, and that resentment has grown. And the last coup they had there, they then invited the Wagner Group, Russian mercenaries, well, you can call them mercenaries or you can call them a sort of informal arm of the Russian military, have come in to supposedly stabilize the situation there and deal with jihadis. I mean, they are also opening Mali up for diamond and gold concessions as well. And then there was a coup in Burkina Faso just a few weeks ago, and people came out in favor of the coup because things are terrible and people think a change will be good. And they demonstrated outside the French embassy down with France, and some people were waving Russian flags. So there is this narrative out there, which is that the colonial powers, or former colonial powers, have let you down, they don't have your interests at heart, and we, Russia, are the ones who are coming to save you.
If you think about when Ukraine's foreign minister, Kuleba, visited the continent and said he was going to try and better explain Ukraine, is it essentially sort of saying, look, you think Russia, formerly the Soviet Union, are your saviors against the Western imperialists. They're actually exploiting you just the way that the imperialists did before. And is that how he's trying to better explain Ukraine?
Yeah, he is trying to explain it like that, and he's also trying to explain it in the sense that this is a a violation of the UN Charter, and that this way madness lies. If it's possible for one country to invade another country and lay waste to it, and that is what is happening in Ukraine, then who's to stop it happening here? And this has a lot to do with you. Do not think that this is, a terrible thing. This is happening to, people in a far off land. This has implications for you as well.
I want to also quickly talk about Saudi Arabia, which I think is an interesting country, because they voted to condemn the annexation of Ukraine by Russia, but they did recently announce that they will cut oil production by 2 million barrels per day, which has really angered the Americans. And it's also pleased the Russians. So what's going on there, Lindsay?
Well, the reason it's angered the Americans is because by cutting production, it means that the oil price is sustained or goes up. And obviously that is also to Russia's advantage, that they want the oil price to go up. And the Saudis were sort of grumbling, saying, well, the reason the Americans are worried about this is because of the midterm elections and Joe Biden doesn't want the price of gas at the pump to go up just before. But it's also because, Saudi and America have such a fractious relationship. And under Donald Trump, the relationship became very close, and he didn't condemn the Saudis for any of the human rights abuses that they commit and so on. And then the journalist Jamal Khashoggi was murdered. And he was murdered by Saudi operatives in Turkey, as you all remember. And the Biden administration has been much more distant from Mohammed bin Salman, who is the effective leader. He's the crown prince in Saudi Arabia. And so the Saudis found a way of annoying the Americans. And also, they like having the oil price high. So a lot of that is to do with the relationship between America and Saudi Arabia. Again, issues which have nothing to do with Russia and Ukraine come to play in these geopolitical calculations.
China and India have said at the UN we should have negotiations. And actually, that's what Putin wants now, since he's annexed these regions. But as you say, that plays into Putin's hand, doesn't it? Because, people have said before, it's all about him seeing this as 19th century history. It's about when all the great powers come together and they carve up Europe, or they carve up, in this case, Ukraine. So when it comes to the issue of Turkey, why would they be seen as a negotiator? And surely the Ukrainians don't want any negotiations.
Well, the Ukrainians certainly don't want negotiations at the moment because they're on the front foot and they are winning on the battlefield. But, Zelensky himself said this war will end in diplomacy. It's just a question of when. Now, obviously, from the Ukrainian point of view, they don't want to do that until, at the moment, they say until they've pushed Russia out of all, not only the territory that it has taken since February this year, but the territory that it took in 2014, including Crimea. Well, that may or may not be possible. But President Erdogan is in a very interesting and important position because he is an autocrat, just like President Putin, and they get on rather well. But Turkey is part of NATO, and yet he has also, much to the irritation of the Americans, bought weapon systems from Russia. We saw over Syria, there was a complex thing that they were on opposite sides in Syria, and yet sometimes managed to work together. This grain deal, the deal which allows Ukrainian grain to go across the Black Sea and, it goes to Istanbul. And it was really, with the UN, the Turks who brokered that. And, Turkey sells Bayraktar drones to Ukraine. And I think, and here I'm looking way, way ahead, if we were ever to talk about, peacekeeping troops or some kind of border, whether it's the 1991 border, which the Ukrainians say it should be, or whether it's a border which is further in, which gives the Russians some territory, which the Ukrainians at the moment say they would never agree to. But whether, if there was some kind of buffer zone, I would see Turkish troops as the ones who potentially would be acceptable to all sides. But I'm way ahead of myself here, aren't I? Because at the moment we are in the middle of this terrible war and it shows no sign of stopping.
And on that point, I guess my final question would be, we started talking about, Russia regional power, superpower. At the beginning of the war, everyone talked about this being the end of the Cold War period, a new period of geopolitics. Is that how has this been a profound war in terms of changing the geopolitics, or in terms of everything we've discussed today, is it actually all just following down the same path?
It could be a big change, because certainly what Ukraine hopes and what many of its Western backers hope is that this will weaken Russia for a generation, if not more. And this is why you get people, certainly governments in states which were formerly Warsaw Pact or were formerly within the Soviet Union. So I'm talking there about, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland. Their point of view is that if you don't stop Putin and Russia now and push him right back, then he will come for us. And so he has to be beaten for a generation. And this is something that European countries and America did not buy before. In 2014, when the Russians invaded and took part of Ukraine, they basically kind of said, well, okay, just don't do it again. And likewise, there was a very weak response when Russia invaded Georgia in 2008 and took two enclaves, which are still under Russian control. And I think that now Western countries are much more convinced of the case which Poland and the Baltic states make. And I think that there is a lot of support for Ukraine in saying we have to win this war and we have to weaken Russia for a generation. But of course, what will the human cost of that be? And what is the human cost of that compared to not doing that? And who pays the price for that? And these are all the complex questions that come up when we look at the geopolitics of it. And we haven't even talked about whether Putin might use a nuclear weapon. Should we leave that for next time?
For next time. Lindsey Hilsum, thank you very much.
Thank you, Kieran.